Finally. All right. I just wanted to clear the chat for everybody here. What the heck, man? This is ridiculous. Okay. Finally. Yay. Okay, here, finally it's working. What a dog's breakfast. So yeah, whatever had happened wound up resetting a few OBS settings, and I had to go wrestle with that very quickly. I shouldn't have to expect that to change my software, but so it did. So more fool me, huh? I should be significantly less quiet now. The microphone's got a very sensitive curve. What can I say? Please let me know if there's any plosives, though, if you'd be so kind. Again, I'm running without any monitoring. Just make sure it don't crash. Okay. So by that, I mean if you hear any, like, pff, you know, kind of noises. Will you do that for me? Appreciate it. Wow. Finally, the thing we're here for. What a ridiculous day. Okay. Yeah, for plosives specifically, but if there's anything weird that you feel I should know about, I'd really appreciate it. You know, like, one of the things most likely to happen is sort of a P noises. Anyway, it's kind of weird. The volume should be sort of good. Anyway, whatever. Too much detail, too much fussing with details, right? I want to tell you about this story because we've been, well, you kind of missed it last week. It's sort of fun. I mean, we're already on chapter 17. We're about almost halfway through. Right then. What a day. In a voyage which I made to the East Indies with Captain Hamilton, I took a favourite pointer with me. He was, to use a common phrase, worth his weight in gold, for he never deceived me. One day when we were, by the best observations we could make, at least 300 leagues from land, my dog pointed. I observed him for near an hour with astonishment, and mentioned the circumstance to the captain and every officer on board, asserting that we must be near land. For my dog smelt game. This occasioned a great laugh, but that did not alter in the least the good opinion I had of my dog. After much conversation pro and con, I boldly told the captain I placed more confidence in Trey's nose than I did in the eyes of every seaman on board, and therefore proposed laying the sum I had agreed to pay for my voyage, these 100 guineas, that we should find game within half an hour. The captain, a good hearty fellow, laughed again, desired Mr. Crawford the surgeon, who was prepared to feel my pulse. And he did so and reported me in good, perfect health. The following... So that's fine, actually, Montreux. I was having some difficulty getting all of this stuff rolling, so you barely missed anything. Like, this paragraph. Nice to see you here. I kind of kicked the Twitch on and off a few times just trying to get it running. The following dialogue between them took place. I overheard it, though spoken low, and at some distance. Captain, his brain is turned. I cannot with honour accept his wager. Surgeon, I am of a different opinion. He is quite sane, and depends more upon the scent of his dog than he will upon the judgment of all the officers on board. He will certainly lose, and he richly merits it. Such a wager cannot be fair on my side. However, I'll take him up if I return his money afterwards. During the above conversation, Trey continued in the same situation, and confirmed me still more in my former opinion. I proposed the wager a second time. It was unaccepted. His brain is a turd. His brain is turned. Turnt. Done and done. were scarcely set on both sides when some sailors who were fishing in the longboat, which was made fast to the stern of the ship, harpooned an exceeding large shark, which they brought on board and began to cut up for the purpose of barreling the oil, when, behold, they found no less than 6 brace of live partridges in this animal's stomach. They had been so long in that situation that one of the hens was sitting upon 4 eggs, and a 5th was hatching when the shark was opened. Wow, that's a lot of exclamation points. I didn't do it justice. This young bird we brought up by placing it with a litter of kittens that came into the world a few minutes before. The old cat was as fond of it as any of her own 4-legged progeny, and made herself very unhappy when it flew out of her reach, till it returned again. As to the other partridges, there were 4 hens amongst them. 1 or more were, during the voyage, constantly sitting, and consequently we had plenty of game at the captain's table, and in gratitude to poor Tray for being a means of winning 100 guineas, I ordered him the bones daily, and sometimes a whole bird. Oh, that's not the crazy part. It's just he had a pointing dog that pointed that there was prey to be had nearby, though they were far a sea. And turns out they were in the shark. His dog was so good, it could smell prey inside the belly of a shark that was deep underwater. I think it was cats brewing over chickens. I'm not even sure this works anywhere. Chapter 18, a second trip to the moon. Oh, he'd gone to the moon already, just in case you weren't aware for that. You weren't there for that, Ms. G. But he's already been to the moon. I have already informed you. I have already long informed you of one trip I made to the moon in search of my silver hatchet. I afterwards made another in a much pleasanter manner, and stayed in it long enough to take notice of several things, which I will endeavor to describe as accurately as my memory will permit. I went on a voyage of discovery at the request of a distant relation, who had a strange notion that there were people to be found equal in magnitude to those described by Gulliver in the empire of Brobdingnag. For my part, I always treated that account as fabulous. However, to oblige him, for he had made me his heir, I undertook it, and sailed for the South Seas, where we arrived without meeting with anything remarkable, except for some flying men and women who were playing at leapfrog and dancing minuets in the air. No big deal. That's a trip I'm glad I did not undertake. On the 18th day after we passed the island of Otaheite, mentioned by Captain Cook as the place from whence they brought Omai, a hurricane blew our ship at least 1,000 leagues above the surface of the water, and kept it at the height till a fresh gale arising filled the sails in every part, and onwards we travelled at a prodigious rate. Thus we proceeded above the clouds for 6 weeks. At last we discovered a great land in the sky, like a shining island, round and bright, where, coming into a convenient harbor, we went on shore, and soon found it was inhabited. Below us we saw another earth, containing cities, trees, mountains, rivers, seas, etc., which we conjectured was this world which we had left. Here we saw huge figures riding upon vultures of a prodigious size, and each of them having 3 heads. To form some idea of the magnitude of these birds, I must inform you that each of their wings is as wide and 6 times the length of the main sheet of our vessel, which was about 600 tons burthen. Thus, instead of riding upon horses, as we do in this world, the inhabitants of the moon, for now we found we were in Madame Luna, fly about on these birds. The king, we found, was engaged in a war with the sun, and he offered me a commission, but I declined the honor his majesty intended me. Everything in this world is of extraordinary magnitude, a common flea being much larger than one of our sheep. In making war, their principal weapon are radishes, which are used as darts, which is reasonable. Those who are wounded by them die immediately. Their shields are made of mushrooms, and their darts, when radishes are out of season, of the tops of asparagus. Some of the natives of the Dog Star are to be seen here. Commerce tempts them to ramble. Their faces are like large mastiffs, with their eyes near the lower end or tip of their noses. They have no eyelids, but cover their eyes with the end of their tongues when they go to sleep. They are generally 20 feet high. As to the natives of the moon, none of them are less in stature than 36 feet. They are not called the human species, but the cooking animals, for they all dress their food by fire, as we do, but lose not time at their meals, as they open their left side and place the whole quantity in at once in their stomach, then shut it again till the same day in the next month, for they never indulge themselves with food more than 12 times a year, or once a month. All but gluttons and epicures must prefer this method to ours. I'm up for some cheese now. There is but one sex either of the cooking or of any other animals in the moon. They are all produced from trees of various sizes and foliage. That which produces the cooking animal, or human species, is much more beautiful than any of the others. It has large, straight boughs and flesh-colored leaves, and the fruit it produces are nuts or pods with hard shells at least 2 yards long. When they become ripe, which is known from their changing color, they are gathered with great care, and laid by as long as they think proper. When they choose to animate the seeds of these nuts, they throw them into a large cauldron of boiling water, which opens the shells in a few hours, and out jumps the creature. Nature forms their minds for different pursuits before they come into the world. From one shell comes forth a warrior, from another a philosopher, from a third a divine, from a fourth a lawyer, from the fifth a farmer, from the sixth a clown, etc., etc. And each of them immediately begins to perfect themselves by practicing what they know, what they before knew only in theory. When they grow old, they do not die, but turn into air and dissolve like smoke. Poof. As for their drink, they need none. The only evacuations they have are insensible and by their breath. They have but one finger upon each hand, the best to flip people off with, I suppose, with which they perform everything in as perfect a manner as we do, who have 4 besides the thumb. Their heads are placed under their right arm, and when they are going to travel or about any violent exercise, they generally leave them at home, for they can consult them at any distance. This is a very common practice, and when those of rank or quality among the lunarians have an inclination to see what's going forward among the common people, they stay at home, i.e., the body stays at home, and sends the head only, which is suffered to be present incog, and returns at pleasure with an account of what has passed. The stones of their grapes are exactly like hail, and I am perfectly satisfied that when a storm or high wind in the moon shakes their vines and breaks the grapes from the stalks, the stones fall down and form our hail showers. I would advise those who are of my opinion to save a quantity of those stones when it hails next, and to make lunarian wine. It is a common beverage at St. Luke's. Some material circumstances I had nearly omitted. They put their bellies to the same use as we do a sack, and throw whatever they have occasion for into it, for they can shut and open it again when they please, as they do their stomachs. They are not troubled with bowels, liver, heart, or any other intestines, neither are they encumbered with clothes, nor is there any part of their bodies unseemly or indecent to exhibit. Their eyes they can take in and out of their places when they please, and can see as well with them in their head as in their head. In their hand as well as in their head. My bad. And if by accident they lose or damage one, they can just borrow or purchase another, and see as clearly with it as their own. Dealers in eyes, on that account, are very numerous in most parts of the moon, and in this article alone all the inhabitants are whimsical. Sometimes green and sometimes yellow eyes are the fashion. I know these things appear strange, but if the shadow of a doubt can remain on any person's mind, I say let him take a voyage there himself, and then he will know I am a traveler of veracity. Nah, it's fine. You know this guy doesn't lie, right? I mean, frankly, maybe I'm a bit of a gourmand because I kind of like the process of eating more times than not. Unless it was frozen crab salad. But that's a chapter for another time. Chapter 19. My first visit to England was about the beginning of the present king's reign. I had occasion to go down to Wapping to see some goods shipped, which I was sending to some friends at Hamburg. After that business was over, I took the Tower Wharf in my way back. Here I found the sun very powerful, and I was so much fatigued that I stepped into one of the cannon to compose me, where I fell fast asleep. Seems cozy. This was about noon. It was the 4th of June. Exactly at 1 o'clock, these cannon were all discharged in memory of the day. They had all been charged that morning, and having no suspicion of my situation, I was shot over the houses on the opposite side of the river, into a farmer's yard between Bermondsey and Deptford, where I fell upon a large haystack without waking, and continued there in a sound sleep till hay became so extravagantly dear, which was about 3 months after, that the farmer found it in his interest to set his whole stock to market. The stack I was reposing upon was the largest in the yard, containing about 500 load. They began to cut that first. I woke with the voices of the people who had ascended the ladders to begin at the top, and got up, totally ignorant of my situation. In attempting to run away, I fell upon the farmer to whom the hay belonged, and broke his neck, yet received no injury myself. I found afterwards, to my great consolation, that this fellow was a most detestable character, always keeping the produce of his grounds for extravagant markets. I mean, what a jerk, right? Trying to make a profit from his crops. Chapter 20. Mr. Drybones' Travels to Sicily, which I had read with great pleasure, induced me to pay a visit to Mount Etna. My voyage to this place was not attended with any circumstances worth relating. One morning early, 3 or 4 days after my arrival, I set out from a cottage where I had slept, within 6 miles of the foot of the mountain, determined to explore the internal parts, if I perished in the attempt. After 3 hours' hard labor, I found myself at the top. It was then, and had been for upwards of 3 weeks, raging. Its appearance in this state had been so frequently noticed by different travelers that I will not tire you with descriptions of objects you are already acquainted with. I walked round the edge of the crater, which appeared to be 50 times at least as capacious as the Devil's Punch Bowl near Petersfield, on the Portsmouth road, but not so broad at the bottom, in that part it resembles the contracted part of a funnel more than a punch bowl. At last, having made up my mind, in I sprang feet foremost. I soon found myself in a warm berth, and my body bruised and burnt in various parts by the red-hot cinders, which, by their violent ascent, opposed my descent. However, my weight soon brought me to the bottom, where I found myself in the midst of noise and clamor, mixed with the most horrid imprecations. After recovering my senses, and feeling a reduction of my pain, I began to look about me. Guess, gentlemen, my astonishment when I found myself in the company of Vulcan and his Cyclops, who had been quarreling, for the 3 weeks before mentioned, about the observation of good order and due subordination, and which had occasioned such alarms for that space of time in the world above. However, my arrival restored peace to the whole society, and Vulcan himself did me the honor of applying plasters to my wounds, which healed them immediately. Oh, it's convenient. Yeah, but only inconvenient little minor burns. It's nothing. He also placed refreshments before me, particularly nectar, and other rich wines, such as the gods and goddesses only aspire to. After this repast was over, Vulcan ordered Venus to show me every indulgence which my situation required. To describe the apartment, and the couch on which I reposed, is totally impossible. Therefore I will not attempt it. Let it suffice to say, it exceeds the power of language to do it justice, or speak of that kind-hearted goddess in any terms equal to her merit. Vulcan gave me a very concise account of Mount Etna. He said it was nothing more than an accumulation of ashes thrown from his forge, that he was frequently obliged to chastise his people, at whom, in his passion, he made it a practice to throw red-hot coals at home, which they often parried with great dexterity, and then threw them up into the world to place them out of his reach, for they never attempted to assault him in return by throwing them back again. Our quarrels, added he, last sometimes 3 or 4 months, and these appearances of coals or cinders in the world are what I find you mortals call eruptions. Mount Vesuvius, he assured me, was another of his shops, to which he had a passage 350 leagues under the bed of the sea, where similar corals produced similar eruptions. I should have continued here as a humble attendant upon Madame Venus, but some busy tattlers, who delight in mischief, whispered a tale in Vulcan's ear, which roused in him a fit of jealousy not to be appeased. Without the least previous notice, he took me one morning under his arm, as I was waiting upon Venus, agreeable to custom, and carried me to an apartment I had never before seen, in which there was, to all appearance, a well with a wide mouth. Over this he held me at arm's length, and saying, "Ungrateful mortal, return to the world from whence you came," without giving me the least opportunity of reply, dropped me into the center. I found myself descending with an increasing rapidity, till the horror of my mind deprived me of all reflection. I suppose I fell into a trance, from which I was suddenly roused by the plunging into a large body of water, illuminated by the rays of the sun. I could, from my infancy, swim well, and play tricks in the water. I now find myself in paradise, considering the horrors of mind I had just been released from. After looking about me some time, I could discover nothing but an expansive sea, extending beyond the eye in every direction. I also found it very cold, a different climate from Master Vulcan's shop. At last, I observed at some distance a body of amazing magnitude, like a huge rock, approaching me. I soon discovered it to be a piece of floating ice. I swam round it till I found a place where I could ascend to the top, which I did, but not without some difficulty. Still, I was out of sight of land, and despair returned with double force. Double force. However, before night came on, I saw a sail, which we approached very fast. When it was within a very small distance, I hailed them in German. They answered in Dutch. I then flung myself into the sea, and they threw out a rope by which I was taken on board. I now inquired where we were, and was informed in the great Southern Ocean. This opened a discovery which removed all my doubts and difficulties. It was now evident that I had passed from Mount Etna through the center of the earth to the South Seas. This, gentlemen, was a much shorter cut than going round the world, and which no man has accomplished or ever attempted but myself. However, the next time I perform it, I will be much more particular in my observations. I took some refreshment and went to rest. The Dutch are a very rude sort of people. I related the Etna passage to the officers exactly as I have done to you, and some of them, particularly the captain, seemed by his grimace and half-sentence to doubt my veracity. However, as he had kindly taken me on board his vessel, and was then in the very act of administering to my necessities, I pocketed the affront. I now, in my turn, began to inquire where they were bound, to which they answered they were in search of new discoveries. "And if," said they, "your story is true, a new passage is really discovered, and we shall not return disappointed." I know. What's with those Dutch, right? Just always... Anyway. We were now exactly in Captain Cook's first track, and arrived the next morning in Botany Bay. This place I would by no means recommend to the English government as a receptacle for felons or place of punishment. It should rather be the reward of merit, nature having most bountifully bestowed her best gifts upon it. And I have a sarcastic thing I would add, but it's probably unfitting. I should keep it to myself. We stayed here but 3 days. The 4th after our departure, a most dreadful storm arose, which in a few hours destroyed all our sails, splintered our bowsprit, and brought down our topmast. It fell directly upon the box that enclosed our compass, which with the compass was broken to pieces. Everyone who had been at sea knows the consequence of such a misfortune. We were now at loss where to steer. At length, the storm abated, which was followed by a steady, brisk gale that carried us at least 40 knots an hour for 6 months. We should suppose the Baron has made a little mistake and substituted months for days. But anyway, when we began to observe an amazing change in everything about us. Our spirits became light, our noses were regaled with the most aromatic effluvia imaginable. The sea had also changed its complexion, and from green became white. Soon after these wonderful alterations we saw land, and not at any great distance an inlet, which we sailed up near 60 leagues, and found it wide and deep, flowing with milk of the most delicious taste. Here we landed, and soon found it was an island consisting of one large cheese. We discovered this by one of the company fainting away as soon as we landed. This man always had an aversion to cheese. When he recovered, he desired the cheese to be taken from under his feet. Upon examination, we found him perfectly right, for the whole island, as before observed, was nothing but a cheese of immense magnitude. I'm with you there. Effluvia is a very gross word. Effluvia to me is what moist is to most people. I mean, well, all right, that needs more unpacking, but that's a tangent. Upon this, the inhabitants, who are amazingly numerous, principally sustain themselves, and it grows every night in proportion as it is consumed in the day. Here seemed to be plenty of vines with bunches of large grapes, which upon being pressed yielded nothing but milk. So they're milk grapes. I guess they're grape nuts. We saw the inhabitants running races upon the surface of the milk. They were upright, comely figures, 9 feet high, have 3 legs and but 1 arm. Upon the whole, their form was graceful, and when they quarrel, they exercise a straight horn, which grows in adults from the center of their foreheads, with great adroitness. They did not sink at all, but ran and walked upon the surface of the milk as we do upon a bowling green. Upon this island of cheese grows great plenty of corn, the ears of which produce loaves of bread, ready-made, of a round form like mushrooms. We discovered in our rambles over this cheese 17 other rivers of milk and 10 of wine. After 38 days' journey, we arrived on the opposite side to that on which we landed. Here we found some blue mold, as cheese-eaters call it, from whence sprang all kinds of rich fruit. Instead of breeding mites, it produced peaches, nectarines, apricots, and 1,000 delicious fruits, which we are not acquainted with. I like some cheese, but I also like to be able to go to the bathroom from time to time. In these trees, which are of an amazing size, were plenty of birds' nests, amongst others with a kingfishers of prodigious magnitude. It was at least twice the circumference of the dome of St. Paul's Church in London. Upon inspection, this nest was made of huge trees curiously joined together. There were, let me see, for I make it a rule to always speak with compass, there were upwards of 500 eggs in the nest, and each of them was as large as 4 common hogsheads, or 8 barrels, and we could not only see, but hear the young ones chirping within. Having, with great fatigue, cut open one of these eggs, we let out a young one unfeathered, considerably larger than 20 full-grown vultures. Just as we had given this youngster his liberty, the old kingfisher lighted, and seizing our captain, who had been active in breaking the egg, in one of her claws, flew with him above a mile high, and then let him drop into the sea, but not till she had beaten out all his teeth out of his mouth with her wings. Dutchmen generally swim well. He soon joined us, and we retreated to our ship. On our return, we took a different route, and observed many strange objects. He was not really inconvenienced by having his teeth punched out clearly. We shot 2 wild oxen, each with 1 horn, also like the inhabitants, except that it sprouted from between the eyes of these animals. We were afterwards concerned at having destroyed them, as we found by inquiry they tamed these creatures, and used them as we do horses, to ride upon and draw their carriages. Their flesh, we were informed, is excellent, but useless where people live upon cheese and milk. When we had reached within 2 days' journey of the ship, we observed 3 men hanging to a tall tree by their heels. Upon inquiring the cause of their punishment, I found they had all been travelers, and upon their return home had deceived their friends by describing places they never saw and relating things that had never happened. This gave me no concern, as I have ever confined myself to facts. All right? As soon as we arrived at the ship, we unmoored and set sail from this extraordinary country, when, to our astonishment, all the trees upon shore, of which there were quite all the trees upon shore, of which were quite a great number, very tall and large, paid their respects to us twice, bowing to exact time, and immediately recovered their former posture, which was quite erect. As by what we could learn of this cheese, it was considerably larger than the continent of all Europe. After sailing 3 months, we knew not where, but still being without compass, we arrived in a sea which appeared to be almost black. Upon tasting it, we found it was most excellent wine, and had great difficulty to keep the sailors from getting drunk with it. However, in a few hours we found ourselves surrounded by whales and other animals of an immense magnitude, one of which appeared to be too large for the eye to form a judgment of. We did not see him till we were close to him. This monster drew our ship with all our masts standing, and the sails bent, by suction into his mouth between his teeth, which were much larger and taller than the mast of the first-rate man of war. That's pretty big. After we had been in his mouth some time, he opened it pretty wide, took in an immense quantity of water, and floated our vessel, which was at least 500 tons burthen, into his stomach. Here we lay as quiet as at anchor in a dead calm. The air, to be sure, was rather warm and very offensive. We found anchors, cables, boats, and barges in abundance, and a considerable number of ships, some laden and some not, which this creature had swallowed. Everything was transacted by torchlight. No sun, no moon, no planet to make observations from. We were all generally afloat and aground twice a day. Whenever he drank, it became high water with us, and when he evacuated, we found ourselves aground. Upon a moderate computation, he took in more water at a single draught than is generally to be found in the Lake of Geneva, though that is above 30 miles in circumference. On the second day of our confinement in these regions of darkness, I ventured at low water, as we called it when the ship was aground, to ramble with the captain and a few of the other officers. With lights in our hands, we met with people of all nations, to the amount of upwards of 10,000. They were going to hold a council how to recover their liberty, some of them having lived in this animal stomach several years. There were several children here who had never seen the world, their mothers having lain in repeatedly in this warm situation. Just as the chairman was going to inform us of the business upon which we were assembled, this plaguey fish, becoming thirsty, drank in his usual manner. The water poured in with such impetuosity that we were all obliged to retreat to our respective ships immediately, or run the risk of being drowned. Some were obliged to swim for it, and with difficulty saved their lives. In a few hours after, we were more fortunate, and met again just after the monster had evacuated. I was chosen chairman, and the first thing I did was to propose splicing two mainmasts together, and the next time he opened his mouth, to be ready to wedge them in so as to prevent his shutting it. It was unanimously approved. 100 stout men were chosen upon this service. We had scarcely got our masts properly prepared when an opportunity offered. The monster opened his mouth, and immediately the top of the mast was placed against the roof, and the other end pierced his tongue, which effectively prevented him from shutting his mouth. As soon as everything in his stomach was afloat, we manned a few boats, who rowed themselves and us into the world. The daylight after, as near as we could judge, 3 months' confinement in total darkness cheered our spirits surprisingly. When we had all taken our leave of this capacious animal, we mustered just a fleet of 95 ships, of all nations, who had been in this confined situation. We left the 2 masts in his mouth to prevent others from being confined in the same horrid gulf of darkness and filth. Our first object was to learn what part of the world we were in. This we were for some time at a loss to ascertain. At last I found, from former observations, that we were in the Caspian Sea, which washes part of the country of the Kalmuck Tartars. How we came here it was impossible to conceive, as this sea has no communication with any other. One of the inhabitants of the Cheese Island, whom I had brought with me, accounted for it thus, that the monster in whose stomach we had been so long confined had carried us here through some subterraneous passage. However, We pushed to shore, and I was the first who landed. Just as I put my foot upon the ground, a large bear leaped upon me with his forepaws. I caught one in each hand and squeezed him till he cried out most lustily. However, in this position, I held him till I starved him to death. You may laugh, gentlemen, but this was soon accomplished, as I prevented him licking his paws. From hence I travelled up to St. Petersburg a second time. Here an old friend gave me a most excellent pointer, descended from the famous bitch before mentioned, that littered while she was hunting a hare. I had the misfortune to have him shot soon after by a blundering sportsman, who fired at him instead of a covey of partridges which he had just set. Of this creature's skin I have had this waistcoat made, showing his waistcoat, which always leads me involuntarily to game if I walk in the fields in the proper season. And when I come within shot, one of the buttons constantly flies off and lodges upon the spot where the sport is. And as the birds rise, always being primed and cocked, I never miss them. Here are now but 3 buttons left. I shall have a new set sewed on again once the shooting season commences. When a covey of partridges, that's hard. When a covey of partridges is disturbed in this manner, by the button falling amongst them, they always rise from the ground in a direct line before each other. I one day, by forgetting to take my ramrod out of my gun, shot it straight through a leash, as regularly as if the cook had spitted them. I had forgot to put in any shot, and the rod had been made so hot with the powder that the birds were completely roasted by the time I reached home. But it's like a friendly dog skin waistcoat because it, always helps you hunt birds. Since my arrival in England, I have accomplished, actually a bunch of roasted birds. That's kind of nice. Oh, I haven't eaten much or anything this morning, so more fool me. Since my arrival in England, I have accomplished what I had very much at heart, viz., providing for the inhabitants of the Cheese Island, which I had brought with me. My old friend, Sir William Chambers, who is entirely indebted to me for all of his ideas of Chinese gardening, by a description of which he has gained such high reputation. I say, gentlemen, in a discourse which I had had with this gentleman, he seemed very much distressed for a contrivance to light the lamps at the new buildings, Somerset House. The common mode with ladders, he observed, was both dirty and inconvenient. My native of the Cheese Island popped into my head. He was only 9 feet high when I first brought him from his home country, but was now increased to 10.5. I introduced him to Sir William, and he is appointed to that honorable office. He is also to carry, under a large cloak, a utensil in each coat pocket, instead of those 4 which Sir William has very properly fixed for the private purpose in so conspicuous a situation, the great quadrangle. Well, after we do some reading, why don't we set about having a proper meal? A 3-legged, 1-armed slender man, if memory serves. He has also obtained from Mr. Pitt the situation of messenger to His Majesty's Lord of the Bedchamber, whose principal employments will now be divulging the secrets of the royal household to their worthy patron. A supplement. About the beginning of His present Majesty's reign, I had some business with a distant relation who then lived on the island of Thanet. It was a family dispute, and not likely to be finished soon. I made it a practice during my residence there, the weather being fine, to walk out every morning. After a few of these excursions, I observed an object upon a great eminence about 3 miles distance. I extended my walk to it, and found the ruins of an ancient temple. I approached it with admiration and astonishment. The traces of grandeur and magnificence which yet remained were evident proofs of its former splendor. Here I could not help lamenting the ravages and devastations of time, of which that once noble structure exhibited such a melancholy proof. I walked round it several times, meditating on the fleeting and transitory nature of all terrestrial things. On the eastern end were the remains of a lofty tower, near 40 feet high, overgrown with ivy, the top apparently flat. I surveyed it on every side very minutely, thinking that if I could gain its summit, I should enjoy the most delightful prospect of the circumjacent country. Animated with this hope, I resolved, if possible, to gain the summit, which I at length effected by means of the ivy, though not without great difficulty and danger. The top I found covered with this evergreen, except a large chasm in the middle. After I had surveyed with pleasing wonder the beauties of art and nature that conspired to enrich the scene, curiosity prompted me to sound the opening in the middle, in order to ascertain its depth, as I entertained a suspicion that it might probably communicate with some unexplored subterranean cavern in the hill. But having no line, I was at a loss how to proceed. After resolving the matter in my thoughts for some time, I resolved to drop a stone down and listen to the echo. Having found one that answered my purpose, I placed myself over the hole, with one foot on each side, and stooping down to listen, I dropped the stone, which I had no sooner done than I heard a rustling below, and suddenly a monstrous eagle put up his head right opposite my face, and rising up with irresistible force, carried me away, seated on his shoulders. I instantly grasped it round the neck, which was large enough to fill my arms, and its wings, when extended, were 10 yards from one extremity to the other. As it rose with a regular ascent, my seat was perfectly easy, and I enjoyed the prospect below with inexpressible pleasure. It hovered over Margate for some time, was seen by several people, and many shots were fired at it. One ball hit the heel of my shoe, but did me no injury. It then directed its course to Dover Cliff, where it alighted, and I thought of dismounting, but was prevented by a sudden discharge of musketry from a party of marines that were exercising on the beach. The balls flew about my head and rattled on the feathers of the eagle like hailstones. Not the eagle like. Yet I could not perceive it had received any injury. It instantly reascended and flew over the sea towards Calais, but so very high that the channel seemed to be no broader than the Thames at London Bridge. In a quarter of an hour I found myself over a thick-wooded France, where the eagle descended very rapidly, which caused me to slip down to the back part of its head. But alighting on a large tree and raising its head, I recovered my seat as before, but saw no possibility of disengaging myself without the danger of being killed by the fall. Though I want to posit this man fell from the moon, so I'm not sure what he's going on about. So I determined to sit fast, thinking it would carry me to the Alps, or to some other high mountain, where I could dismount without any danger. After resting a few minutes, it took wing, flew several times round the wood, and screamed loud enough to be heard across the English Channel. In a few minutes, one of the same species arose out of the wood, and flew directly towards us. It surveyed me with evident marks of displeasure, and came very near me. After flying several times round, they both directed their course to the southwest. I soon observed that the one I rode upon could not keep pace with the other, but inclined towards the earth on account of my weight. Its companion, perceiving this, turned round and placed itself in such a position that the other could rest its head on its rump. In this manner they proceeded till noon, when I saw the rock of Gibraltar very distinctly. The day being clear, notwithstanding my degree of elevation, the earth's surface appeared just like a map, where land, sea, lakes, rivers, mountains, and the like were perfectly distinguishable. And having some knowledge of geography, I was at no loss to determine what part of the globe I was in. This is a first sight better than the other thing. Whilst I was contemplating this wonderful prospect, a dreadful howling suddenly began all around me, and in a moment I was invested by thousands of small, black, deformed, frightful-looking creatures, who pressed me on all sides in such a manner that I could neither move hand or foot. But had I not been in their possession more than 10 minutes, when I heard the most delightful music that can be possibly imagined, which was suddenly changed into a noise the most awful and tremendous, to which the report of cannon, or the loudest claps of thunder, could bear no more proportion than the gentle zephyrs of the evening to the most dreadful hurricane. But the shortness of its duration prevented all those fatal effects which a prolongation of it would certainly have been attended with. Yeah, it's important to know where you're going when you're being hauled away by eagles. The music commenced. and I saw a great number of the most beautiful little creatures seize the other party and throw them with great violence into something like a snuff box, which they shut down, and one threw it away with incredible velocity. Then, turning to me, they said they whom he had secured were a party of devils who had wandered from their proper habitation, and that the vehicle in they were enclosed would fly with unabating rapidity for 10,000 years, when it would burst of its own accord, and the devils would recover their liberty and faculties, as at the present moment. He had no sooner finished this relation than the music ceased, and they all disappeared, leaving me in a state of mind bordering on the confines of despair. When I had recomposed myself a little, and looking before me with inexpressible pleasure, I observed that the eagles were preparing to light on the peak of Teneriffe. They descended on the top of the rock, but seeing no possible means of escape if I dismounted, determined me to remain where I was. The eagles sat down, seemingly fatigued, when the heat of the sun soon caused them both to fall asleep, nor did I long resist its fascinating power. In the cool of the evening, when the sun had retired below the horizon, I was roused from sleep by the eagle moving under me, and having stretched myself along its back, I sat up and reassumed my traveling position, when they both took wing, and having placed themselves as before, directed their course to South America. The moon shining bright during the whole night, I had a fine view of all the islands in those seas. About the break of day, we reached the great continent of America, that part called terra firma. And, terra firma, it's near Toronto or something, and descended on the top of a very high mountain. At this time the moon, far distant in the west, and obscured by dark clouds, but just afforded light sufficient for me to discover a kind of shrubbery all around, bearing fruit something like cabbages, Brussels sprouts, which the eagles began to feed on very eagerly. I endeavored to discover my situation, but fogs and passing clouds involved me in the thickest darkness, and what rendered the scene still more shocking was the tremendous howling of wild beasts, some of which appeared to be very near. However, I determined to keep my seat, imagining that the eagle would carry me away if any of them should make a hostile attempt. When daylight began to appear, I thought of examining the fruit which I had seen the eagles eat, and as some was hanging which I could easily come at, I took out my knife and cut a slice. But how great was my surprise to see that it had all the appearances of roast beef regularly mixed, both fat and lean. So they're roast beef Brussels sprouts. I tasted it and found it well flavored and delicious, then cut several large slices and put in my pocket, where I found a crust of bread which I had brought from Margate, took it out, and found 3 musket balls that had been lodged in it on Dover Cliff. I extracted them, and cutting a few slices more, made a hearty meal of bread and cold beef fruit. I then cut down 2 of the largest that grew near me, and tying them together with one of my garters, hung them over the eagle's neck for another occasion, filling my pockets at the same time. When I was settling these affairs, I observed a large fruit like an inflated bladder, which I wished to try an experiment upon, and striking my knife into one of them, a fine pure liquor like Holland's gin rushed out, which the eagles observing eagerly drank up from the ground. I cut down the bladder as fast as I could, and saved about half a pint in the bottom of it, which I tasted and could not distinguish it from the best mountain wine. I drank it all, and found myself greatly refreshed. By this time the eagles began to stagger against the shrubs. He's made them drunk. I endeavored to keep my seat, but was soon thrown to some distance among the bushes. In attempting to rise, I put my hand upon a large hedgehog which happened to lie among the grass upon its back. It instantly closed round my hand, so that I found it impossible to shake it off. I struck it several times against the ground without effect, but while I was thus employed, I heard a rustling among the shrubbery, and looking up, I saw a huge animal within 3 yards of me. I could make no defense, but held out both my hands when it rushed upon me, and seized that on which the hedgehog was fixed. My hand soon being relieved, I ran to some distance, where I saw the creature suddenly drop down and expire with the hedgehog in its throat. When the danger was past, I went to view the eagles, and found them lying on the grass fast asleep, being intoxicated with the liquor they had drunk. Indeed, I found myself considerably elevated by it, and seeing everything quiet, I began to search for some more, which I soon found, and having cut down 2 large bladders, about a gallon each, I tied them together and hung them over the neck of the other eagle, and the 2 smaller ones I tied with a cord round my own waist. Having secured a good stock of provisions, and perceiving the eagles begin to recover, I again took my seat. In half an hour they rose majestically from the place, without taking the least notice of their encumbrance. It's the Eagle Bernards. Each reassumed its former station, and directing their course to the northward, they crossed the Gulf of Mexico, entered North America, and steered directly for the polar regions, which gave me the finest opportunity of viewing this vast continent that can possibly be imagined. Before we entered the frigid zone, the cold began to affect me, but piercing one of my bladders, I took a draught and found that it could make no impression on me afterwards. Passing over Hudson's Bay, I saw several of the company's ships lying at anchor, and many tribes of Indians marching with their furs to market. By this time, I was so reconciled to my seat and became such an expert rider that I could sit up and look around me. But in general, I lay along the eagle's neck, grasping it in my arms with my hands immersed in its feathers, in order to keep them warm. In those cold climates, I observed that the eagles flew with greater rapidity, in order, I suppose, to keep their blood in circulation. In passing Baffin's Bay, it's getting cold, I saw several large Greenland men to the eastward, and many surprising mountains of ice in those seas. While I was surveying these wonders of nature, it occurred to me that this was a good opportunity to discover the Northwest Passage. Ah, he's right. If any such thing existed, and not only obtain the reward offered by the government, but the honor of a discovery pregnant with so many advantages to every European nation. But while my thoughts were absorbed in this pleasing reverie, I was alarmed by the first eagle striking his head against a solid transparent substance, and in a moment that which I rode experienced the same fate, and both fell down, seemingly dead. Here our lives must inevitably have terminated, had not a sense of danger, and the singularity of my situation, inspired me with a degree of skill and dexterity which enables us to fall near 2 miles perpendicular with as little inconveniency as if we had been let down with a rope, for no sooner did I perceive the eagle strike against a frozen cloud, which is very common near the poles, then, they being close together, I laid myself along the back of the foremost, and took hold of its wings to keep them extended, at the same time stretching out my legs behind to support the wings of the other. This had the desired effect, and we descended very safe on a mountain of ice, which I suppose to be about 3 miles above the level of the sea. You know, I could totally believe that. It's all clear now that we have this heretofore untold historical account. I dismounted, unloaded the eagles, opened one of the bladders, and administered some of the liquor to each of them, without once considering that the horrors of destruction seemed to have conspired against me. The roaring of waves, crashing of ice, and the howling of bears conspired to form a scene the most awful and tremendous, but notwithstanding this, my concern for the recovery of the eagles was so great that I was insensible of the danger to which I was exposed. Having rendered them every assistance in my power, I stood over them in painful anxiety, fully sensible that it was only by means of them that I could possibly be delivered from these abodes of despair. But suddenly, a monstrous bear began to roar behind me with a voice like thunder. I turned round, and seeing the creature just ready to devour me, having the bladder of liquor in my hands, through fear I squeezed it so hard that it burst, and the liquor flying in the eyes of the animal totally deprived it of sight. It instantly turned from me, ran away in a state of distraction, and soon fell over a precipice of ice into the sea, where I saw it no more. The danger being over, I again turned my attention to the eagles, whom I found in a fair way of recovery, and suspecting that they were faint for want of victuals, I took one of the beef fruit, cut it into small slices, and presented them with it, which they devoured with avidity. Having given them plenty to eat and drink, and disposed of the remainder of my provisions, I took possession of my seat as before. After composing myself, and adjusting everything in the best manner, I began to eat and drink very heartily, and through the effects of the mountain wine, as I called it, was very cheerful, and began to sing a few verses of a song which I had learned when I was a boy. But the noise soon alarmed the eagles, who had been asleep, through the quantity of liquor which they had drank, and they rose seemingly much terrified. Happily for me, however, when I was feeding them, I had accidentally turned their heads towards the southeast, which course they pursued with a rapid motion. In a few hours, I saw the Western Isles, and soon after had the inexpressible pleasure of seeing Old England. I took no notice of the seas or islands over which I passed. The eagles descended gradually as they drew near the shore, intending, as I supposed, to alight on one of the Welsh mountains. But when they came to the distance of about 60 yards, 2 guns were fired at them, loaded with balls, one of which took place in a bladder of liquor that hung to my waist. The other entered the breast of the foremost eagle, who fell to the ground, while that which I rode, having received no injury, flew away with amazing swiftness. This circumstance alarmed me exceedingly, and as I began to think it was impossible for me to escape with my life, but recovering a little, I once more looked down upon the earth, when, to my inexpressible joy, I saw Margate at a little distance, and the eagle descending on the old tower whence it carried me on the morning of the day before. It no sooner came down than I threw myself off, happy to find that I was once more restored to the world. The eagle flew away in a few minutes, and I sat down to compose my fluttering spirits, which I did in a few hours. I soon paid a visit to my friends and related these adventures. Amazement stood in every countenance. Their congratulations on my returning in safety were repeated with an unaffected degree of pleasure, and we passed the evening as we are doing now, every person present paying the highest compliments to my courage and veracity. So don't you doubt it. Gosh, Baron Munchausen, you are so... I was going to say voracious, but that's not quite the right word. You are so honest and believable. It's the best. You saved the eagles from the frozen cloud. But as you say, facts, I tell you. Facts! The second volume. I'm going to read this preface, too. The preface to the second volume. Baron Munchausen has certainly been productive of much benefit to the literary world. The number of egregious travelers have been such that if they demanded a very Gulliver to surpass them, if Baron de Tott dauntlessly discharged an enormous piece of artillery, the Baron Munchausen has done more. He has taken it and swam with it across the sea. When travelers are solicitous to be the heroes of their own story, surely they must admit to superiority, and blush at seeing themselves outdone by the renowned Munchausen. I doubt whether anyone hitherto, Pantagruel, Gargantua, Captain Lemuel, or de Tott, has been able to outdo our Baron in this species of excellence. Well, that's not true, because this guy hasn't pissed an army away, so that's one up for Gargantua. And as at present our curiosity seems much directed to the interior of Africa, it must be edifying to have the real relation of Munchausen adventures there before any further intelligence arrives, for he seems to adapt himself and his exploits to the spirit of the times, and recounts what he thinks should be most interesting to his auditors. You know, you're totally right. So far, no punners either. I do not say that the Baron, in the following stories, means a satire on any political matters whatever. No. But if the reader understands them so, I cannot help it. If the Baron meets with a parcel of Negro ships carrying whites into slavery to work upon their plantations in a cold climate, should we therefore imagine that he intends a reflection on the present traffic in human flesh? And what, if the Negroes should do so, it would be simple justice, as retaliation is the law of God. If we were to think this a reflection on any present commercial or political matter, we should be tempted to imagine, perhaps, some political ideas conveyed in every page, in every sentence of the whole. Whether such things are or are not the intentions of the Baron, the reader must judge. We have had not only wonderful travelers in this vile world, but splenetic travelers, and of these not a few, and also conspicuous enough. It is a pity, therefore, that the Baron has not endeavored to surpass them also in this species of storytelling. Who is it can read the travels of Smelfungus, as Sterne calls him, without admiration? To think that a person from the north of Scotland should travel through some of the finest countries in Europe and find fault with everything he meets, nothing to please him, and therefore, methinks, the tour to the Hebrides is more excusable, and also, perhaps, Mr. Twiss's tour in Ireland. Dr. Johnson, bred in the luxuriance of London, with more reason should become cross and splenetic in the bleak and dreary regions of the Hebrides. The Baron, in the following work, seems to be somewhat philosophical. His account of the language of the interior of Africa, and its analogy with that of the inhabitants of the moon, show him to be profoundly versed in the etymological antiquities of nations, and throw new light upon the abstruse history of the ancient Scythians and the Collectania. His endeavor to abolish the custom of eating live flesh in the interior of Africa, as described in Bruce's travels, is truly humane. But far be it from me to suppose that by Gog and Magog and the Lord's Mayor Show he means a satire upon any person or body of persons whatever, or by a tedious litigated trial of blind judges and dumb matrons following a wild goose chase all around the world, he should glance at any trial whatever. Nevertheless, I must allow that it was extremely presumptuous in Munchausen to tell half the sovereigns of the world that they were wrong, and advise them what they ought to do, and that instead of ordering millions of their subjects to massacre one another, it would be more in their interest to employ their forces in the concert for the general good. As if he knew better than the Empress of Russia, the Grand Vizier, Prince Potemkin, or any other butcher in the world. But that he should be a royal aristocrat, and take the part of the injured Queen of France in the present political drama, I am not at all surprised. But I suppose his mind was fired by reading the pamphlet written by Mr. Burke. Well, that's going to go somewhere. Let's find out where. Chapter 21. All that I have related before, said the Baron, is gospel. And if there be any one so hardy as to deny it, I am ready to fight him with any weapon he pleases. Yes, cried he, in a more elevated tone, as he started from his seat, I will condemn him to swallow this decanter, glass and all perhaps, and filled with Karanwasser, a kind of ardent spirit distilled from cherries. And much, sounds nice, actually. Therefore, my dear friends and companions, have confidence in what I say and pay honor to the tales of Munchausen. A traveler has the right to relate and embellish his adventures as he pleases. It is very unpolite to refuse that deference and applause they deserve. Having passed some time in England since the completion of my former memoirs, I at length began to revolve in my mind what a prodigious field of discovery must be in the interior part of Africa. I could not sleep with the thoughts of it. I therefore determined to gain every proper assistance from government to penetrate the celebrated source of the Nile, and assume the viceroyship of the interior kingdoms of Africa, or at least the great realm of Monomotapa. It was happy for me that I had one most powerful friend at court, whom I shall call the illustrious Hilaro Frosticos. You perchance know him not by that name, but we had a language among ourselves, as well we may, for in the course of my peregrinations I have acquired precisely 999 leash of languages. What? Gentlemen, do you stare? Well, I allow that there are not so many languages spoken in this vile world, but then, have I not been in the moon? And trust me, whenever I write a treatise upon education, I shall delineate methods of inculcating whole dozens of languages at once, French, Spanish, Greek, Hebrew, Cherokee, etc., in such a style as will shame all the pedagogues existing. He's been around 20 times and he's been to the moon, but he hasn't been to Africa, so let's see what's to be seen. Having passed a whole night without being able to sleep for the vivid imagination of African discoveries, I hastened to the levee of my illustrious friend Hilaro Frosticos, and having mentioned my intention with all the vigor of fancy, he gravely considered my words, and after some awful meditations, thus he spoke: O loch, margenisat istum fulana, cum dera cargos belgarachesium balgo barticos triangulissimus. Ooh. However, added he, it behoveth thee to consider and ponder well upon the perils and the multitudinous dangers in the way of that wight who thus advanceth in all the perambulation of adventures. And verily, most valiant sire and baron, I hope thou wilt demean thyself with all that laudable gravity and precaution which, as is related in the 347th chapter of the Prophylactics, is of more consideration than all the merits in this terraqueous globe. Yes, most duly do I advise thee unto thy good, and speak unto thee, most valiant Munchausen. I would have turned it, if I turned an owl into a crumpet, I would be eating really well right now. With the great esteem, and wish thee to succeed in thy voyage, for it is said that in the interior realms of Africa there are tribes that can see but just 3 inches and a half beyond the extremity of their noses, and verily thou shouldst moderate thyself, even sure and slow. They stumble who walk fast. But we shall bring you unto Lady Fragrantria, and have her opinion of the matter. He then took from his pocket a cap of dignity, such as described in the most honorable and antique heraldry, and placing it upon my head, addressed me thus: As thou seemest again to revive the spirit of ancient adventure, permit me to place upon thy head this favor, as a mark of the esteem in which I hold thy valorous disposition. The Lady Fragrantria, my dear friends, was one of the most divine creatures in all Great Britain, and was desperately in love with me. She was drawing my portrait upon a piece of white satin when the most noble Hilario Frosticos advanced. He pointed to the cap of dignity which he had placed upon my head. I do declare, Hilario, said the lovely Fragrantria. 'Tis pretty, 'tis interesting. I love you and I like you, my dear baron, she said, putting on another plume. This gives it an air more delicate and more fantastical. I do thus, my dear Munchausen, as your friend. Yet you can reject or accept my present just as you please. But I like the fancy. 'Tis a good one, and I mean to improve it. And against whatever enemies you go, I shall have the sweet satisfaction to remember you bear my favor on your head. I snatched it with trepidation, and gracefully dropping on my knees, I 3 times kissed it with all the rapture of romantic love. I swear, cried I, by the bright eyes, and by the lovely whiteness of thine arm, that no savage, tyrant, or enemy upon the face of the earth shall despoil me of this favor, while 1 drop of the blood of the Munchausens doth circulate in my veins. I will bear it triumphant through the realms of Africa, whither I now intend my course, and make it respected even in the court of Prester John. I admire your spirit, replied she, and shall use my utmost interest at court to have you dispatched with every pomp and as soon as possible. But here comes a most brilliant company indeed. Lady Carolina Wilhelmina Amelia Skeggs, Lord Spigot, and Lady Fawcett, and the Countess of Bel-Air. Anyway, never mind. Never mind what I was thinking. I don't think I could make it funny. After the ceremonies of introduction to this company were over, we proceeded to consult upon the business, and as the cause met with general applause, it was immediately determined that I should proceed without delay, as soon as I obtained the sovereign approbation. I am convinced, said Lord Spigot, that if there be anything really unknown and worthy of our most ardent curiosity, it must be in the immense regions of Africa, of that country, which seems to be the oldest on the globe, and yet with the greatest part of which we are almost utterly unacquainted. What prodigious wealth of gold and diamonds must not lie concealed in those torrid regions, when the very rivers on the coast pour forth continual specimens of golden sand. That was exactly what I was thinking there, G. So you totally nailed it. But far better than I did. 'Tis my opinion, therefore, that the Baron deserves the applause of all Europe for his spirit, and merits the most powerful assistance of the sovereign. So flattering an approbation, you may be sure, was delightful to my heart, and with every confidence and joy I suffered them to take me to court that instant. After the usual ceremonies of introduction, suffice it to say that I met with every honor and applause that my most sanguine expectations could demand. I had always a taste for the fashionable je ne sais quoi of the most elegant society, and in the presence of all the sovereigns of Europe I ever found myself quite at home, and experienced from the whole court the most flattering esteem and admiration. I remember, one particular day, the fate of the unfortunate Marquis de Belcourt. The Countess of Racinda, who accompanied him, looked most divinely. "Yes, I am confident," said the Marquis de Belcourt to me, "that I have acted according to the strictest sentiments of justice and of loyalty to my sovereign. What stronger breastplate than a heart untainted? And though I did not receive a word nor a look, yet I cannot think, no, it were impossible to be misrepresented." And then everyone in the GameStop applauded. Conscious of my own integrity, I will try again. I will go boldly up. The Marquis de Belcourt saw the opportunity. He advanced 3 paces, put his hand upon his breast, and bowed. "Permit me," said he, "with the most profound respect to—" His tongue faltered. He could scarcely believe his sight, for at that moment the whole company were moving out of the room. He found himself almost alone, deserted by everyone. "What?" said he. "And did he turn upon his heel with the most marked contempt? Would he not speak to me? Would he not even hear me utter a word in my defense?" His heart died within him. Not even a look, a smile from anyone. "My friends, do they not know me? Do they not see me? Alas, they feared to catch the contagion of my—" "Then," said he, "adieu, 'tis more than I can bear. I shall go to my country seat, and never, never will return. Adieu, Fancourt, adieu." The venerable Marquis de Belcourt stopped for a moment ere he entered his carriage. Thrice he looked back, and thrice he wiped the starting tear from his eye. "Yes," said he, "for at once at least truth shall be found, in the bottom of a well." Peace to thy ghost, most noble Marquis, or Marquis, I suppose to say correctly. A king of kings shall pity thee, and thousands who are yet unborn shall owe their happiness to thee, and have cause to bless the thousands, perhaps, that shall never even know thy name. But Munchausen's self shall celebrate thy glory. I'm not even sure where that went. That seems kind of melancholy suddenly. Chapter 22. Everything being concluded, and having received my instructions for the voyage, I was conducted by the illustrious Hilaro Frosticos, the Lady Fragrantria, and a prodigious crowd of nobility, and placed sitting upon the summit of the whale's bones at the palace, and having remained in this situation for 3 days and 3 nights, as a trial ordeal, and a specimen of my perseverance and resolution.
Was not quite a sausage dog where I was buying into it.
But
sausages.
As a specimen of my perseverance and resolution, the 3rd hour after midnight they seated me in the chariot of Queen Mab. It was a prodigious dimension, large enough to contain more stowage than the ton of Heidelberg, and globular like a hazelnut. In fact, it seemed to be, really, a hazelnut grown to a most extravagant dimension, and that a great worm of proportionable enormity had bored a hole in the shell. Through the same entrance I was ushered. It was as large as a coach door, and I took my seat in the center, a kind of chair self-balanced. A kind of chair self-balanced without touching anything, like the fancied tomb of Mahomet. The whole interior surface of the nutshell appeared a luminous representation of all the stars of heaven, the fixed stars, the planets, and a comet. The stars were as large as those worn by our first nobility, and the comet, excessively brilliant, seemed as if you had assembled all the eyes of the beautiful girls in the kingdom and combined them, like a peacock's plumage, into the form of a comet. That is, a globe and a bearded tail to it, diminishing gradually to a point. This beautiful constellation seemed very sportive and delightful. It was much in the form of a tadpole, and without ceasing went, full of playful giddiness, up and down all over the heaven on the concave surface of the nutshell. One time it would be at that part of the heavens under my feet, and in the next minute would be over my head. It was never at rest, but forever going east, west, north, or south, and paid no more respect to the different worlds than if they were so many lanterns without reflectors. Some of them he would dash against and push out from their places. Others he would burn up and consume to ashes, and others again he would split into fritters, and their fragments would instantly take a globular form, like spilled quicksilver, and become satellites to whatever other worlds they should happen to meet with in their career. In short, the whole seemed an epitome of the creation, past, present, and future, and all that passes among the stars during 1,000 years was here generally performed in as many seconds. I surveyed all the beauties of the chariot with wonder and delight. "Certainly," cried I, "this is heaven in miniature." In short, I took the reins in my hand. But before I proceeded on my adventures, I shall mention the rest of my attendant furniture. The chariot was drawn by a team of 9 bulls harnessed to it, 3 after 3. In the first rank was a most tremendous bull named John Mowski. The rest were called Jacks in general, but not dignified by any particular denomination. They were all shod for the journey, not indeed like horses with iron, or as bullocks commonly are to drag on a cart, but were shod with men's skulls. Each of their feet was, hoof and all, crammed into a man's head, cut off for the purpose, and fastened therein with a kind of cement or paste, so that the skull seemed to be part of the Each of their feet was... Sorry, start again. I'm already having a hard time. Each seemed to be part of the foot and hoof of the animal. With these skull shoes, the creatures could perform astonishing journeys, and slide upon the water or upon the ocean with great velocity. The harnesses were fastened with golden buckles, and decked with studs in a superior style, and the creatures were ridden by 9 postilions, crickets of a great size, as large as monkeys, who sat squat upon the heads of the bulls, and were continually chirping at a most infernal rate, loud in proportion to their bodies. I do like the sound of skull-hoof bulls. The wheels of the chariot consisted of upwards of 10,000 springs, formed so as to give a greater impetuosity to the vehicle, and were more complex than a dozen clocks like that at Strasbourg. The external of the chariot was adorned with banners, and a superb festoon of laurel that formerly shaded me on horseback. And now, having given you a very concise description of my machine for traveling into Africa, which you must allow to be far superior to the apparatus of Monsieur Vaillant, I shall proceed to relate the exploits of my voyage. Yeah, this makes sense now. It's like, well, that guy had a pretty cool carriage, but I had a cool carriage with skull hoof bulls. And it's got like a miniature solar system inside. And anyway, chapter 23. Taking the reins in my hand, while the music gave a general salute, I cracked my whip, away they went, and in 3 hours I found myself just between the Isle of Wight and the mainland of England. Here I remained 4 days, until I had received part of my accompaniment. I used to be able to say these words easily. What the heck, man? Which I was ordered to take under my convoy. 'Twas a squadron of men of war that had been a long time prepared for the Baltic, but which were now destined for the Mediterranean. By the assistance of large hooks and eyes, exactly such as are worn in our hats, but of a greater size, some 100 weight each, the men of war hooked themselves onto the wheels of the vehicle, and, in fact, nothing could be more simple or convenient, because they could be hooked or unhooked in an instant with the utmost facility. In short, having been given a general discharge of their artillery and 3 cheers, I cracked my whip, and away we went, helter-skelter, and in 6 jiffies I found myself and all my retinue safe and in good spirits just at the Rock of Gibraltar. So this is why Britain was so powerful at sea, because they could use the Skullhulf bulls and the Chariot of Mab to pull whole warships around the ocean in a matter of hours. It's amazing. Here I unhooked my squadron, and having taken an affectionate leave of the officers, I suffered them to proceed in their ordinary manner to the place of their destination. The whole garrison were highly delighted with the novelty of my vehicle, and at the pressing solicitations of the governor and officers, I went ashore and took a view of that barren old rock, about which more powder has been fired away than would purchase twice as much fertile ground in any part of the world. Mounting my chariot, I took the reins and again made forward in mad career down the Mediterranean to the Isle of Candia. Here I received dispatches from the Sublime Porte, entreating me to assist in the war against Russia, with a reward of the whole Isle of Candia for my alliance. At first I hesitated, thinking that the Isle of Candia would be a most valuable acquisition to the sovereign who at that time employed me, and that the most delicious wines, sugar, etc., in abundance would flourish on the island. Yet, when I considered the trade of the East India Company, which would most probably suffer by the intercourse with Persia through the Mediterranean, I at once rejected the proposal, and had afterwards the thanks of the House of Commons for my propriety and political discernment. Having been properly refreshed at Candia, I again proceeded, and in a short time arrived in the land of Egypt. The land of this country, at least that part of it near the sea, is very low, so that I came upon it ere I was aware, and the pillar of Pompeii got entangled in the various wheels of the machine, and damaged the whole considerably. Still I drove on through thick and thin, till, passing over that great obelisk, the Needle of Cleopatra, the work got entangled again, and jolted at a miserable rate over the mud and swampy ground of all that country. Yet my poor bulls trotted on with astonishing labor across the Isthmus of Suez into the Red Sea, and left a track, an obscure channel, which has since been taken by Detot for the remains of a canal cut by some of the Ptolemies from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, but, as you perceive, was in reality no more than the track of my chariot, the car of Queen Mab. As the artists at present in that country are nothing wonderful, though the ancient Egyptians, 'tis said, are the most astonishing fellows, I could not procure any new coach springs, or have a possibility of setting my machine to rights in the kingdom of Egypt. And as I could not presume to attempt another journey over land, and the great mountains of marbles beyond the source of the Nile, I thought it most eligible to make the best I could, by sea, to the Cape of Good Hope, where I supposed I should get some Dutch smiths and carpenters, or perhaps some English artists, and my vehicle being properly repaired, it was my intention thence to proceed overland through the heart of Africa. The surface of the water, I knew well, afforded less resistance to the wheels of the machine. It passed along the waves like the chariot of Neptune, and, in short, having gotten upon the Red Sea, we scudded away to admiration through the pass of Bab el Mandeb to the great western coast of Africa, where Alexander had not the courage to venture. And really, my friends, if Alexander had ventured towards the Cape of Good Hope, he most probably would never have returned. It is difficult to determine whether there were then any inhabitants in the most southern parts of Africa or not. Yet, at any rate, this conqueror of the world would have made but a nonsensical adventure. His miserable ships, not contrived for a long voyage, would have become leaky and foundered before he could have doubled the Cape. and left his majesty fairly beyond the limits of the then known world. Yet it would have been an august exit for an Alexander, having subdued Persia and India, to be wandering the Lord knows where, to Jup or Ammon perhaps, or on a voyage to the moon, as an Indian chief once said to Captain Cook. You know, you can say many things about Baron Munchausen, and you are, both of you, but you can't say he's modest. He's just spitting facts here. But for my part, I was far more successful than Alexander. I drove on with the most amazing rapidity, and thinking to halt on shore at the Cape, I unfortunately drove too close and shattered the right side wheels of my vehicle against the rock, now called the Table Mountain. The vehicle went against it with such impetuosity as completely shivered the rock in a horizontal direction, so that the summit of the mountain, in the form of a semisphere, was knocked into the sea, and the steep mountain, becoming thereby flattened at the top, has since received the name of the Table Mountain, from its similarity to that piece of furniture. Just as this part of the mountain was knocked off, the ghost of the Cape, that tremendous sprite which cut such a figure in the Lusiad, was discovered sitting squat in an excavation formed for him in the center of the mountain. He seems just like a young bee in his little cell before he comes forth, or like a bean in a bean pod, and when the upper part of the mountain was split across and knocked off, the superior half of his person was discovered. He appeared of a bottle blue color, and started, dazzled with the unexpected glare of the sunlight. Hearing the dreadful rattle of the wheels and the loud chirping of the crickets, he was thunderstruck, and instantly giving a shriek, sunk down 10,000 fathoms into the earth, while the mountain, vomiting out some smoke, silently closed up, and left not a trace behind. I mean, you're right, Montreth. I think actually there's a chapter going on where he meets the Queen of Modesty, who anoints him with many rewards for the great powers of modesty that he demonstrates. That he's in fact the most modest person that ever was. And then they fired him out of a cannon and he came home. Chapter 24. I perceived with grief and consternation the miscarriage of all my apparatus. Yet I was not absolutely dejected. A great mind is never known but in adversity. With permission of the Dutch governor, the chariot was properly laid up in a great storehouse, erected at the water's edge, and the bulls received every refreshment possible after so terrible a voyage. Well, you may be sure they deserved it, and therefore every attendance was engaged for them, until I should return. As it was not possible to do anything more, I took my passage in a homebound Indiaman, to return to London and lay the matter before the Privy Council. We met with nothing particular until we arrived upon the coast of Guinea, where, to our utter astonishment, we perceived a great hill, seemingly of glass, advancing against us in the open sea. The rays of the sun were reflected upon it with such splendor that it was extremely difficult to gaze at the phenomenon. I immediately knew it to be an island of ice, and though in so very warm a latitude, determined to make all possible sail from such a horrible danger. We did so, but all in vain. For about 11 o'clock at night, blowing a very hard gale and exceedingly dark, we struck upon the island. Nothing could equal the distraction, the shrieks, and the despair of the whole crew, until I, knowing there was not a moment to be lost, cheered up their spirits, and bade them not to despond, but do as I should request them. In a few minutes the vessel was half full of water, and the enormous castle of ice that seemed to hem us in on every side, in some places falling in hideous fragments upon the deck, killed one half of the crew, upon which, getting upon the summit of the mast, I contrived to make it fast to a great promontory of the ice, and calling to the remainder of the crew to follow me, we all escaped from the wreck, and got upon the summit of the island. The rising sun soon gave us a dreadful prospect of our situation, and the loss, or rather icification, of the vessel, for being closed in on every side with castles of ice during the night, she was absolutely frozen over, and buried in such a manner that we could behold her under our feet, and even in the central solidity of the island. Having debated what was best to be done, we immediately cut down through the ice and got up some of the cables of the vessel, and the boats, which, making fast to the island, we towed it with all our might, determined to bring home island and all, or perish in the attempt. On the summit of the island we placed what oakum and dregs of every kind of matter we could get from the vessel, which in the space of a very few hours, on account of the liquefying of the ice and the warmth of the sun, were transformed into a very fine manure. And as I had some seeds of exotic vegetables in my pocket, we shortly had a sufficiency of fruits and roots growing upon the island to supply the whole crew, especially the breadfruit tree, and a few plants of which had been in the vessel, and another tree which bore plum puddings so very hot, and with such exquisite proportion of the sugar, fruit, etc., that we all acknowledged it was not possible to taste anything of the kind more delicious in England. In short, though the scurvy had made such dreadful progress among the crew before our striking upon the ice, the supply of vegetables, and especially the breadfruit and pudding fruit, put an almost immediate stop to the distemper. You know, Africa is famous for how cold it is, so this makes complete sense to me. We had proceeded thus many weeks, advancing with an incredible fatigue by continual towing, when we fell in with a fleet of negro men, as they call them. These wretches, I must inform you, my dear friends, had found the means to make prizes of those vessels from some Europeans upon the coast of Guinea, and tasting the sweets of luxury, had formed colonies in several new discovered islands near the South Pole, where they had a variety of plantations of such matters as would only grow in the coldest climates. So, buffaloes, I suppose. As the black inhabitants of Guinea were unsuited to the climate and excessive cold of the country, they formed the diabolical project of getting Christian slaves to work for them. For this purpose they sent vessels every year to the coast of Scotland, to the northern parts of Ireland and Wales, and were even sometimes seen off the coast of Cornwall. And having purchased or entrapped by fraud or violence a great number of men, women, and children, they proceeded with their cargoes of human flesh to the other end of the world, and sold them to their planters, where they were flogged into obedience and made to work like horses all the rest of their lives. Oh, I'm not sure how I feel about this, but let's continue. My blood ran cold at the idea, while everyone on the island also expressed his horror that such an iniquitous traffic should be suffered to exist. But, except by open violence, it was found impossible to destroy the trade, on account of a barbarous prejudice, entertained of late by the Negroes, that the white people have no souls. Now that makes sense, actually. However, we were determined to attack them, and steering down our island upon them, soon overwhelmed them. We saved as many of the white people as possible, but pushed all the blacks into the water again. I'm less comfortable with this. The poor creatures we saved from slavery were so overjoyed that they wept aloud through gratitude, and we experienced every delightful sensation to think what happiness we should shower upon their parents, their brothers and sisters and children, by bringing them home safe, redeemed from slavery to the bosom of their nature. Having happily arrived in England, I immediately laid a statement of my voyage, etc., before the Privy Council, and entreated immediate assistance to travel into Africa, and, if possible, refit my former machine and take it along with the rest. Everything was instantly granted to my satisfaction, and I received orders to get myself ready for departure as soon as possible. As the Emperor of China had sent a most curious animal as a present to England, which was kept in the Tower, and it being of an enormous stature, and capable of performing the voyage with éclat, she was ordered to attend me. She was called Sphinx, and was of the most tremendous though magnificent figures I had ever beheld. She was harnessed with superb trappings to a large flat-bottomed boat, in which was placed an edifice of wood, exactly resembling Westminster Hall. 2 balloons were placed over it, tackled by a number of ropes to the boat, to keep up a proper equilibrium, and prevent it from overturning or filling from the prodigious weight of the fabric. The interior of the edifice was decorated with seats in the form of an amphitheater. I mean, I'm just gonna pause here. I mean, you are completely right, Montress. It's a complete flipping around. Um, and it's awkward to consider now, etc., etc. And maybe there's a little bit more geopolitical than I was kind of hoping for. I mean, we're back to, and then yeah, I mean, like the Emperor of China just made a barge pulled by the Sphinx, and it was kind of all right, but I've seen better. Anyway, um, the interior of the edifice was decorated with seats in the form of an amphitheater, and crammed as full as it could hold with lords and ladies, as a council and retinue for your humble servant. Near in the center was a seat elegantly decorated for myself, and on either side of me were placed the famous Gog and Magog in all their pomp. And yeah, this makes sense. The Sphinx is Chinese. The Lord Viscount Gossamer being our postilion. We floated gallantly down the river, the noble Sphinx gambolling like the huge Leviathan and towing after her the boat and balloons. Thus we advanced, sailing gently into the open sea. Being calm weather, we could scarcely feel the motion of the vessel, and passed our time in grand debate upon the glorious intention of our voyage and the discoveries that would result. Then I'm going to say, though, like, if China can mount, like, balloon-lifted barges being towed by sphinxes, I mean, they should have been a significant naval power in this world. I am of the opinion, said my noble friend Hilario Frosticos, I didn't have much of a voice for him, but I forgot what it was, that Africa was originally inhabited for the greater part, or I may say, subjugated by lions, which, next to man, seem to be the most dreaded of all mortal tyrants. The country in general, at least that we have hitherto able to discover, seems rather inimical to human life. The intolerable dryness of the place, the burning sands that overwhelm whole armies and cities in general ruin, and the hideous life many roving hordes are compelled to lead, incline me to think that if ever we form any great settlements therein, it will become the grave of our countrymen. Yet it is nearer to us than the East Indies, and I cannot imagine that in many places every production of China and of the East and West Indies would flourish, if properly attended to. And as the country is so prodigiously extensive and unknown, what a source of discovery must not it contain? In fact, we know less about the interior of Africa than we do of the moon, for in this latter we measure the very prominences and observe the varieties and inequalities of the surface through our glasses. Forest and mountains on her spotted orb. But we see nothing in the interior of Africa, but what some compilers of maps or geographers are fanciful enough to imagine. What a happy event, therefore, should we not expect from a voyage of discovery and colonization undertaken in so magnificent a style as the present. What a pride, what an acquisition to philosophy. Chapter 25. The brave Count Gossamer, with a pair of hellfire spurs on, riding upon Sphinx, directed the whole retinue towards the Madeiras. But the Count had no small share of an amiable vanity, and perceiving great multitudes of people, Gascons, etc., assembled upon the French coast, I'm amused that the Gascons are not people here, he could not refrain from showing some singular capers, such as they had never seen before, but especially when he observed all the members of the National Assembly extend themselves along the shore as a piece of French politeness to honor this expedition with Rousseau, Voltaire, and Beelzebub at their head. He set spurs to Sphinx, and at the same time cut and cracked away as hard as he could, holding in the reins with all his might, striving to make the creature plunge and show some uncommon diversion. But sulky and ill-tempered was Sphinx at the time. She plunged indeed, such a devil of a plunge, that she dashed him in one jerk over her head, and he fell precipitately into the water before her. It was in the Bay of Biscay, all the world knows a very boisterous sea, and Sphinx, fearing he would be drowned, never turned to the left or the right out of her way, but advancing furious, just stooped her head a little, and supped the poor count off the water into her mouth, together with a quantity of 2 or 3 tons of water, which she must have taken in along with him, but which were, to such an enormous creature as Sphinx, nothing more than a spoonful would be to any of you or me. I'm sure, I can't imagine for a second why you would want to think that thought, G. No sooner was, she swallowed him, but when she had got him in her stomach, his long spurs, so scratched and tickled her that they produced the effect of an emetic. No sooner was he in, but out he was squirted with the most horrible impetuosity, like a ball or a shell from the caliber of a mortar. Sphinx was at this time quite seasick, and the unfortunate count was driven forth like a skyrocket, and landed upon the peak of Tenerife, plunged over her head and ears in the snow. Requiescat in pace. I guess that's how you say that. Rip in peace, dude. I perceived all this mischief from my seat in the ark, but was in such a convulsion of laughter that I could not utter an intelligible word. And now Sphinx, deprived of her postilion, went on in a zigzag direction, and gamboled away after a most dreadful manner. And thus had everything gone to wreck, had I not given instant orders to Gog and Magog to sally forth. They plunged into the water, and swimming on each side, got at length right before the animal, and then seized the reins. Thus they continued swimming on each side, like Tritons, holding the muzzle of Sphinx, while I, sallying forth astride upon the creature's back, steered forward on our voyage to the Cape of Good Hope. I couldn't begin to tell you if it really was a jibe at them, and it felt like one. He's not very fond of the French, for some reason I can't begin to imagine. I can't imagine why anybody who's fond of England would be upset at the French. Let me put it that way. Arriving at the Cape, I immediately gave orders to repair my former chariot and machines, which were very expeditiously performed by the excellent artists I had brought with me from Europe. And now, everything being refitted, we launched forth upon the water. Perhaps there never was anything seen more glorious or more august. He's hinted at it, rather. I mean, he's not been really overt, but he has been fairly clear about what he's not the fondest of them. 'Twas magnificent. Behold, Sphinx made her obeisance on the water, and the crickets chirp upon the bulls in return of the salute, while Gog and Magog, advancing, took the reins of the great John Mowmowski, and leading towards us, chariot and all, instantly disposed of them to the forepart of the ark by hooks and eyes, and tackled Sphinx before all the bulls. Thus the whole had a most tremendous and triumphal appearance. In front floated forwards the mighty Sphinx, with Gog and Magog on either side. Next followed in order the bulls with crickets upon their heads, and then advanced the chariot of Queen Mab, containing the curious seat and orrery of heaven, after which appeared the boat and ark of council, overtopped with 2 balloons, which gave an air of greater lightness and elegance to the whole. I placed in the galleries under the balloons, and on the backs of the bulls, a number of excellent vocal performers, with martial music of clarionets and trumpets. They sung the watery dangers and the pomp of deep cerulean. The sun shone glorious on the water, while the procession advanced toward the land, under 500 arches of ice, illuminated with colored lights, and adorned in the most grotesque and fanciful style, with seaweed, elegant festoons, and shells of every kind, while 1,000 waterspouts danced eternally before and after us, attracting the water from the sea in a kind of cone, and suddenly united with the most fantastical thunder and lightning. I can't even begin to imagine what's going on anymore. It's just a whole lot of adjectives flying around. Having landed our whole retinue, we immediately began to proceed toward the heart of Africa, but first thought it expedient to place a number of wheels under the ark for its greater facility of advancing. We journeyed nearly due north for several days, and met with nothing remarkable except the astonishment of the savage natives to behold our appendage. The Dutch government at the Cape, to do them justice, gave us every possible assistance for the expedition. I presume they had received instruction on that head from their high mightiness in Holland. However, they presented us with a specimen of some of the most excellent of their Cape wine, and showed us every politeness in their power. As to the face of the country, as we advanced, it appeared in many places capable of every cultivation, and of abundant fertility. The natives and Hottentots of this part of Africa having been frequently described by travelers, and therefore it is not necessary to say any more about them. But in the more interior parts of Africa, the appearance, manners, and genius of the people are totally different. We directed our course by the compass and the stars, I'm not objecting to that part. There should always be wine. Just a little. We directed our compass by the compass and the stars, getting every day prodigious quantities of game in the woods, and at night encamping within a proper enclosure for fear of the wild beasts. One whole day in particular we heard on every side, among the hills, the horrible roaring of lions, resounding from rock to rock like broken thunder. It seemed as if there was excuse me. Air's a little still because I have all these windows closed so we don't have to hear the festival. It seemed as if there was a general rendezvous of all these savage animals to fall upon our party. That whole day we advanced with caution, our hunters scarcely venturing beyond pistol shot from the caravan for fear of dissolution. At night, we encamped as usual, and threw up a circular entrenchment round our tents. We had scarce retired to repose when we found ourselves serenaded by at least 1,000 lions, approaching equally on every side and within 100 paces. Our cattle showed the most horrible symptoms of fear, all trembling and in cold perspiration. I directly ordered the whole company to stand to their arms and not to make any noise by firing till I should command them. I then took a large quantity of tar, which I had brought with our caravan for that purpose, and strewed it in a continued stream round the encampment, within which circle of tar I immediately placed another train or circle of gunpowder, and having taken this precaution, I anxiously awaited the lion's approach. These dreadful animals, knowing, I presume, the force of our troop, advanced very slowly and with caution, approaching on every side of us with an equal pace, and growling in hideous concert, so as to resemble an earthquake, or some similar convulsion of the world. When they had at length advanced and steeped all their paws in the tar, they put their noses to it, smelling it as if they were blood, and daubed their great bushy hair and whiskers with it equal to their paws. At that very instant, when in concert they were to give the mortal dart upon us, I discharged a pistol at the train of gunpowder, which instantly exploded on every side, made all the lions recoil in a general uproar, and to take flight with the utmost precipitation. In an instant we could behold them scattered through the woods at some great distance, roaring in agony, and moving about like so many will-o'-the-wisps, their paws and faces all on fire from the tar and the gunpowder. I then ordered a general pursuit. We followed them on every side through the woods, their own light serving as our guide, until, before the rising of the sun, we followed into their fastness, and shot, and otherwise destroyed every one of them. And during the whole of our journey, we never heard the roaring of a lion, nor did any wild beast presume to make another attack upon our party, which shows the excellent immediate presence of mind, and the terror inspired into the savage enemies by a proper and well-timed proceeding. Ha! All right. We at length arrived on the confines of an immeasurable desert, an immense plain, extending on every side of us like an ocean. Not a tree, nor a shrub, nor a blade of grass was to be seen, but all appeared in extreme fine sand, mixed with gold dust and little sparkling pearls. The gold dust and pearls appeared to us of little value, because we could have no expectation of returning to England for a considerable time. We observed, at great distance, something like a smoke arising just over the verge of the horizon, and looking with our telescopes, we perceived it to be a whirlwind, tearing up the sand and tossing it about in the heavens with a frightful impetuosity. I immediately ordered my company to erect a mound around us of a great size, which we did with astonishing labor and perseverance, and then roofed it over with certain planks and timber, with which we had with us for the purpose. Our labor was scarcely finished when the sand came rolling in like the waves of the sea. 'Twas a storm and river of sand united. It continued to advance in the same direction without intermission for 3 days, and completely covered over the mound we had erected, and buried us all within. The intense heat of the place was intolerable, but guessing by the cessation of the noise that the storm was past, we set about digging a passage to the light of day again, which we effected in a very short time, and ascending, perceived that the whole had been so completely covered with the sand that there appeared no hills, but one continued plain, with inequalities or ridges on it like the waves of the sea. We soon extricated our vehicle and retinue from the burning sands, but not without great danger, as the heat was very violent, and began to proceed on our voyage. Storms of sand of a similar nature several times attacked us, but by using the same precautions, we preserved ourselves repeatedly from destruction. Having traveled more than 9,000 miles over this inhospitable plain, exposed to the perpendicular rays of a burning sun, without ever meeting a rivulet or a shower from heaven to refresh us, we at length became almost desperate, when, to our inexpressible joy, we beheld some mountains at a great distance, and on our nearer approach observed them covered with a carpet of verdure and groves and woods. Nothing could appear more romantic or beautiful than the rocks and precipices intermingled with flowers and shrubs of every kind, and palm trees of such a prodigious size as to surpass anything ever seen in Europe. Fruits of all kinds appeared growing wild in the utmost abundance, and antelopes and sheep and buffaloes wandered about the groves and valleys in profusion. The trees resounded with a melody of birds, and everything displayed a general scene of rural happiness and joy. And what a happy note to end on. They're not going to die from the desert after all. Well, I mean, they are bigger palm trees than you'd see in Europe, so the statement is factually correct, and you cannot argue him. That's where we're going to take a break. Now, there's a festival outside, and if we're going to go out there, we got to go do it today. So, plus I'm ravenous, and I just kept thinking about food the whole time. On the note, I want to thank you for being here, because without an audience, this show is nothing to me. You're wonderful. I'll see you all next week, or, next time I do some streaming thing. Where's my mouse? Take care.